So tonight, my title, the title of this talk, War Unmakes the State, of course, is a raised eyebrow nod to Charles Tilly and the history of state building, and his famous line, "War makes a state, and the state makes war." But I pose it in form of a question, and that's purposeful, because when I have an audience like this, I want to focus more on questions and approaches than answers that I have. I'm working through this myself. I'm working through a lot of these ideas myself. And I can be convinced, especially in an audience like this, that I'm wrong. And if you take the time to convince me I'm wrong, you'll help me not make mistakes in print later on. So instead of giving you something definitive, an ex cathedra, I'm giving you something a little bit more personal, perhaps even idiosyncratic, in talking about the Habsburg Empire and its internal wars. What I want to do today is give you a sense of my intellectual trajectory so far. How have I gotten here to start thinking about these questions, so you can maybe understand why I'm asking the questions I'm asking. So I hope you'll indulge me on this front. And I want to start by opening up a sort of a discussion here about paradigms and problems in the historiography of the Habsburg Empire, and particularly in regards to the First World War. I think there's a lot of research that can and should be done here. And if any of you are looking for a second project or something, you feel bored with what you're doing right now, I think Habsburg studies with regards to the First World War needs a lot of help. So maybe I can convince you to devote some of your time and energy to the topic. The paradigms and problems of the Habsburg historiography, I think, stem from a few issues, as I see them. On the one hand, the history of the Habsburg Empire as a whole, not just in the First World War, but as a whole, has been traditionally written as if it were a sideshow. And following Hegel's philosophy of history, where Hegel tells us the Habsburg Empire is not a kingdom, but an empire, i.e. an aggregate of many political organizations, its inhabitants of its chief provinces are not German in origin and character, and have remained unaffected by ideas. Remember, ideas are important. Elevated neither by education nor religion, the lower classes in some districts have remained in a condition of serfdom, and the nobility have been kept down, as in Bohemia. In other quarters, where the former have continued the same, the barons have maintained their despotism, as in Hungary. Austria has surrendered that more intimate connection with Germany. Remember, this is 19-teens, 1920s, when he's speaking this. 18, thank you, yes, 1820s. So we haven't, yes. Definitely by 1920 they've surrendered that intimate connection with Germany. But 1820...
Don't make them more backward than
they are, yeah. But he says that they've surrendered this more intimate connection with Germany, which was derived from the imperial dignity, and renounced its numerous possessions and rights in Germany and the Netherlands. It now takes its place in Europe as a distinct power involved with no other. Historiography of the Habsburg Empire sort of followed Hegel in saying this is not a place where progress is happening, where history, where the world spirit is pushing life and being forward. And so therefore the Habsburg Empire is not really worth studying when we try to understand European history at large, when we're trying to understand the larger movements that are taking place in European history. The Habsburg Empire is not going to tell us anything. We need to study pinnacle civilizations like Germany or like France. So the Habsburg Empire in European historiography generally has been cast as an also-ran or a sideshow or even a forgotten realm. The larger assumption is that the history of the Habsburg Empire can tell us very little about European history in general. It's hardly mentioned in, well, at least when I was going to college in the 1990s, it wasn't part of Western Civ histories and lectures. And the empire more or less served as an ephemeral background to other national histories. German history, Polish national history, Czech national history, Yugoslav histories. It was like the Habsburg Empire was this historical storage container where nations lived and eventually emerged out of, and then they became historical. Now I say this as really as a background to the revision of the Habsburg Empire that's taken place in historiography, in Habsburg Imperial studies. In the face of the traditionalist view following Hegel, which sees the Habsburg Empire as an anachronism in modern Europe, there's been a striking and thorough revision undertaken by legions of historians in the US and Britain, and also increasingly in Central Europe. These sea changes in historiography have brought us new approaches, new arguments, and especially a new attitude, a way of sort of imploding the Habsburg Empire within European history. The primary focus of this revision has been sort of local and regional politics, histories about civil society or civil societies in the Habsburg Empire, the entangling development of national histories, that national histories in the Habsburg Empire should be read and written about as entangled, and of course national indifference, the idea that there's some people in the Habsburg Empire that could be code switchers or even indifferent to nationalist movements or national movements. What the thrust of the research now seems to support, or at least move in the direction of, are fairly large claims. And some of these are made tangentially, and some of these are made more forcefully, but I think this isn't very controversial. If this was a room of Habsburg historians, everyone would be kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, yes, the nations of the Habsburg Empire did not want out. There is really not much of a centrifugal forces paradigm that tells us much about what's going on in Habsburg Central Europe. We shouldn't write about the Habsburg Empire as a prison of the peoples. Rather, we should think about it, again, as national movements emerging who have an entangled history. Divisions are mutable and could be drawn, but they could also be drawn by liberal, conservative, radical politics, not just national politics, religious versus secular, or according to class. So things are more complicated than we originally like to believe, than traditional histories have liked to believe. And finally, the biggest claim would be that the monarchy shouldn't be written about as if it's in decline before 1914. In fact, a lot of the historiography now, in the past 30 years, is focused on the vibrant political, cultural, scientific, and social life that Habsburg citizens enjoyed. They've written about nationality movements and nationalist politics as if coalitions were possible. Optimism was generally present in the various national movements in the monarchy. And political fights could also be integrative. Not centrifugal, but integrative. Remember, when the Czechs are arguing for more X or more Y within the context of imperial politics, they're planning on staying in the empire for a while longer. Otherwise, why argue for X and Y? So these are the trends that were already underway when I began my dissertation research in the 2000s. And in many ways, I was following the attitude of the scholars of revisionism that began in the 1980s. And their attitude, which I think has been very influential, was to look at and appreciate what made the Habsburg Empire resilient. And a byproduct of this attitude was to see continuity and, importantly, to study the institutions of the empire like parliaments, city governments, schools, industrial organizations, and banks, to talk about Habsburg civil society. What I thought was a useful intervention would be to write the story of the state. A lot of the histories that were written in the 1980s and 1990s looking at political movements and civil society groups tended to treat the state as monolithic, or at least a big granite block at which civil society could chip away. And I wanted to examine that. So these are the things I focused on: state building, infrastructural power, creation of a professional bureaucracy, the birth of constitutionalism and representative government, and the core of the project was really shaped by this new attitude that had emerged. And the attitude really asked us to not suppose that the Habsburg Empire was doomed to fail. We can treat it as a surprise. In fact, there are many people and groups useful to understand that they could imagine the 1920s or the 1930s and the Habsburg Empire still being present. So there is a future, idea of a future there that we can recapture. And by treating the Habsburg Empire not necessarily as destined to fail in 1860 or 1880 or 1900 or even June 27th, 1914, could allow us to make useful, or to produce useful knowledge, thinking comparatively between the Habsburg Empire and Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, other states that the Habsburg Empire usually isn't compared to, because these are states that survived the First World War, and at least excluding Britain, they're not necessarily empires, at least on the European continent. France, of course, is an exception too. And some of the ideas that emerged from my work on this, or at least within my thinking about it, was the Habsburg Empire shared in the general European trends for better and for worse. There was infrastructure building, like bridges, railroads, roads, electrification, growing prosperity and wealth creation, scientific discovery, industrialization, urbanization, increasing social problems and social pressures. The good and the bad of the 19th century, both there in equal measure, comparable to the rest of Europe. So this first book, it really was an old-fashioned history. It focused on political and constitutional developments in the Habsburg monarchy. I think it could have been written in 1968 and probably survived just fine in that environment too. I almost tried to write a sort of an old-fashioned history because there hadn't existed one before. And I tried to argue that over the course of the long 19th century, the building up of an educated imperial bureaucracy evolved into a larger issue: how to accommodate, channel, and use political participation. Increasingly, this meant working with and channeling national movements, not necessarily fighting them. I originally intended my history of the Habsburg Empire and state building project to go to 1918. After all, the Habsburg Empire doesn't disappear from the map until 1918. And in some ways, I hope to sort of, as a cap to the book, understand how the Age of Security was created and formed and how it fell, thinking this was a simple story. But I had a problem. Once I really dug into the research on both the historiography and looking in the archival research that I was able to do on the Habsburg monarchy between 1914 and 1918, all the threads and the lines that I had been following from the 1780s really dissolved in the First World War. And moreover, the recent attempts within the historiography to talk about the Habsburg Empire in terms of continuities didn't really capture the ruptures that occurred in the First World War. So a few things became clear to me. My first book, A History of the Habsburg State Building Project, had to end a little bit earlier than I had planned if I wanted to submit it on time to get tenure. Yes, I wanted to continue to eat and have health insurance. So the story ends basically in 1914 with the declaration of war. A second corollary, less pragmatic, is that I began to think about the First World War itself as a rupture occurring not in 1918, the way we typically treat the Habsburg Empire and the First World War, that the rupture in Central Europe happens when the Habsburg Empire dissolves, and when the monarchy fell and new nation states populated the map of Europe. This was the traditional story I'd learned in comps, right? The rupture is in 1918. Instead, I started to think about a major rupture in Central Europe occurring in 1914, when the empire went to war. And in working on this, and reading the historiography, one of the first things I noticed within the historiography of the Habsburg Empire is that when we get to the First World War, many things change. within the way we talk about the Habsburg Empire. Even with this 30 years of revisionist activity. And part of the issue is that World War I tends to be its own field, attracting its own group of historians that aren't necessarily long 19th century historians. And the historiography of the First World War tends to be separated from the internal historiography of the monarchy and from European history. The historiography then doesn't really share the attitudes that many of the revisionist work in the last 30 years has done, and the assumptions they make seem to be totally different. Within the historiography of the First World War, and within Habsburg historiography of the First World War, the Habsburg Empire still follows this old paradigm of a declining, doomed anachronism. Hegel still seems to rule when we talk about the Habsburg Empire in the First World War. And some of this has to do with the evidence we use. Historians who work on the First World War in Central Europe tend to look at different types of evidence than historians who have been working to revise the picture of the Habsburg Empire. And so the big narratives tend to be different. Of course, the evidence they use are military records and foreign ministry records. So one could say maybe there's a source distortion going on. So after nearly 30 years of revisionist work on the Habsburg Empire, which has performed fundamental changes in the way historians read the domestic politics of the Habsburg Empire, World War I still seems to prop up the overall idea of decline. And of course, there's a large literature to fall back on. And one of the greats in Habsburg historiography that is still read and used extensively in First World War histories is the work of Robert Kahn. Now, of course, Robert Kahn was an immigrant from Austria. He came to the United States in the 1930s, in 1938, I believe. He was already a doctor of law. He received a doctorate of law, I think, at the University of Vienna. But he went back and received a PhD at Columbia University, and then proceeded to train historians at Rutgers, especially through his written work. And for Kahn, writing in 1974, World War I was the fulfillment of a long-term disintegration process. He writes, the disintegration process is an important chapter in a history of the Habsburg Empire, but after all, it is just one chapter in a long chain of events. What happened within a few war years is, in essence, only an abstract of a long, drawn-out process of decline. The Habsburg monarchy at the beginning of the war was, according to Kahn, doomed to dissolution. It's these types of tropes that were prominent before 1980 that are still with us when we talk about the First World War in general. A popular Channel 4 documentary on the First World War shows nicely how these older traditional domestic narratives that really don't have a lot of traction anymore within Habsburg history are still used in how the general historiography of the First World War, and even with the recent publications commemorating the 100th year, under the centenary of the First World War, they're still present. And it shows us how little of the work of domestic Habsburg historians have made inroads into larger European narratives, both of the First World War and European history. For instance, about 10 minutes into this documentary, which was advised by Ustron, who is an excellent historian, tells us that the empire was ruled, now I'm quoting, by Franz Ferdinand's uncle, Franz Joseph. He sat on 2 thrones, as Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. By 1914, he had been in charge for 66 years. He had spent them trying to resist change of any kind. Hardly ever seen out of military uniform, he hated the very idea of political reform. For countries like Serbia, Austria-Hungary was the prison of nations, a repressive, undemocratic state that ground small peoples under its heel. In 1905, there were nationalist demonstrations in Vienna. In 1912, there was rioting in Budapest. By 1914, there had been ethnic unrest in almost every part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Local parliaments were suspended, and troops were brought in to restore order. This is in essence the absolutism and anarchy paradigm that Gary Cohen criticized in a 1998 article. And Gary Cohen, writing in 1998, pointed out that historians don't write like this anymore. But in 2004, this seemed worthy of putting on screen. So you can imagine, for someone like me, writing a dissertation and then a first book in the long 19th century, entering into the general historiography of the First World War, I felt like I was entering an alternative universe. And all the faces, all the names in the book seemed to be familiar, but the personalities seemed to be different. And you get lines in books, in good books, like these, that the Habsburg Empire was a holdover from the Middle Ages. Its roots went back to the coronation of Charlemagne. It doesn't write that about Germany, but maybe one could talk about France and Germany that way too. A ramshackle structure, fearful of its too many Slavs in the new sick man of Europe. So what happens? What happened to all of these new approaches?
They dress funny.
They dress funny, yeah. Those are Slovaks, and yeah, Slovaks dress funny. But I mean, one of the things that I'm wondering generally is that is there really a selection bias that goes on? If we're writing about the First World War, we're only reading documents that come out of the foreign ministry, which is overrepresented by the aristocracy in the Habsburg Empire, lamenting social change, and of course military documents, which are very similar. Do we take on the attitudes of the documents we're reading, and are we unable to put them in a larger context? A lot of historians, of course, have worked with the political archive in Berlin, the foreign ministry, the German foreign ministry archive, and of course, reading Ambassador von Czierski's reports about Vienna back to Berlin, they're sort of instructive on where some of our attitudes, our traditional attitudes, come from. One report has him lamenting the retreat of the German element in Austrian politics and sees the Slavicization of the country leading to certain dissolution. So a larger point I think needs to be rectified, and why I said at the beginning of the lecture that I really want to maybe convince you to start working on this too, is that there seems to be a yawning sort of communication gap between historians who generally work and study on the Habsburg monarchy in general and larger European histories of the First World War. In our treatments of the First World War, there's hardly been any recognition that a new consensus has emerged within the history of the Habsburg Empire domestically. And the persistence of the old tropes that the Habsburg Empire fell because of long-standing nationality conflict are still with us. And paradoxically, what it means is that when historians working on the First World War write about the Habsburg Empire in the context of the First World War, they downplay the significance of the First World War. If we argue that this was just a decrepit building, ready to be blown over by a strong wind, it could have been any wind. And this is instead of seeing the First World War as instrumental in destroying the Habsburg Empire. I think part of it is our fault, as in the revisionist group's fault. Political histories like mine tend to end in 1914. We don't know how to cross what I think is a rupture in 1914 with the declaration of war on July 28th. So war becomes a sad final chapter that makes little sense in a long narrative that doesn't emphasize decline. We don't really know how to implot the First World War and long-standing histories of the Habsburg Empire. It doesn't fit very neatly into our implotments. So the historiographic problem becomes one of linking the First World War to what comes before, and also trying to explain this break and the fundamental changes that war brings about. And so what I want to do now is sort of give you a sense of how I'm trying to approach it. I haven't finished. This is still a work in progress. So any input you have would be very appreciated. But my preliminary approach to bridging this gap is to look at the way Austria-Hungary managed its prosecution of the war. What changed when Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914? And primarily what I've been thinking about is Austria-Hungary's state of emergency or state of exception, this creation of an extrajudicial trans-constitutional system that begins with the declaration of war. And to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I'm going to quote a letter of July 26, 1914, from Prime Minister Karl Storch, who was the Prime Minister of the Austrian half, the Empire, to all of the imperial governors, these civil servants nominally appointed by the Emperor, suggested by the Minister of the Interior and the Prime Minister, who were in charge of all the provinces. Of course, this letter was marked highly confidential, so as you can imagine, the Habsburg Empire, every governor passed it on to all of his staff, including the district officials and everyone else. So if in any archive you find in the former Habsburg Empire, you'll find a copy of this highly confidential letter that I've seen at least 20 copies of. Storch writes that the martial events which lie before us make it completely irrefutable that all organs of the state administration must unite their full effort and collective strength around one goal, the mobilization and application of the military forces in the service of the fatherland. Storch goes on to remind his governors to cultivate and encourage the patriotic cooperation of all the monarchy's peoples without regard to class, nation, or confession. He also made it clear that the political administration, that is, the bureaucracy, was to set aside all matters of internal politics and to orient all the collective energies of the state to the assured, quick, and complete achievement of our war aims. He also went on to make sure that the bureaucracy knew that they were to follow orders given by the military. And what we're going to see is generally a constitutional problem that emerges. This constitutional problem begins with four factors. Emergency legislation is declared more or less on July 26th in Austria, July 25th, 26th in Bosnia, and a little bit later, I think, July 28th in Hungary. And this is, of course, an extrajudicial space where the monarchy suspends a lot of its civil rights laws, its constitutional laws protecting freedom of speech, addressing how crimes should be prosecuted and tried, what are the rights of people under indictment, that sort of thing. And the idea, generally, is that we've entered this moment of crisis where the civilian government's general rights it gives to citizens in the Constitution are suspended in favor of military necessity. And of course the idea here is that the military won't overstep its bounds because the emperor, as the supreme warlord and the head of state, will hold both the military and civilian spheres in balance in his two very strong, virile hands. These constitutional provisions, of course, of emergency legislation, suspension of constitutional rights, were written in 1867 and 1868, when Franz Josef was 37 years old. In 1914, he's 84. He now supposedly it's his role as head of state and supreme warlord to hold these things in balance, to make sure the military doesn't overstep its lines of authority and go too far, and preserve civilian rights because parliaments are shuttered and the bureaucracy is supposed to enact what the military tells it to do. What happens, I think, is that the military will start to use this opportunity to mold the Austro-Hungarian state as it sees fit, and increasingly ignoring Franz Josef and the civilian bureaucracy. Of course, at first, in July and August 1914, the civilian bureaucracy, the Habsburg monarchy, goes along with these mobilization and emergency legislation provisions. And between the 26th of July and the 31st of July 1914, the joint ministry of Austria-Hungary, as well as the ministerial councils for the Austrian half of the monarchy and the Hungarian half, would release a series of laws that established these martial provisions. These laws would be supplemented over the next 3 years by an additional 154 emergency laws and 510 additional ordinances, promulgated by cabinet ministers themselves. The laws did everything from from regulating industrial production, so the total war effort and the economy, to veterinary medicine. This was an empire of total war. But the laws also established a system of control, censorship, and retributive justice. And I don't mean that in the 21st century terms, but retribution, which would mark Austria-Hungary's domestic system during the First World War as extremely repressive. So this age of security that Stefan Zweig writes about in his memoirs, by September 1914 is becoming something else entirely, a state of exception. And I think the crux here is that the old predictable Habsburg state, under these emergency law provisions, becomes increasingly unpredictable and erratic. The solid predictability, the one that came from the cumbersome but assiduous adherence to the rule of law and regulations, those things that we like to make fun of the Habsburg monarchy for, really dissolves in a solution of extrajudicial actions, often pushed forward by overzealous military commanders, both in Vienna and in Silesia, where Conrad von Hertzendorf is largely based in the first 3 years of the war. 2 local commanders just acting on their own. Such extrajudicial measures received, by September, strong responses from civilian officials who tried increasingly to stand up for provisions in the Constitution and tell military men that they couldn't do what they were doing. We see a bureaucracy increasingly trying to defend the rule of law. So some of the things that I've been looking at then are military ideas of politics and what how the military men see the Austrian state functioning before the war. What ideas inform their behavior post-August 1914? How did military men read civilian life and national development? This thing that we write about in our long 19th century histories about national movements and nationality politics as being integrative, this sort of thing. What I've tried to do is maybe isolate an anti-political habitus within military officers. How does the military, and what informs their implementing so much on the back of military necessity? What do they do? When it comes to the First World War itself, what we see increasingly is the military persecuting movements and leaders they deem to be anti-military or anti-state under special provisions from emergency law, martial law, Standrecht. What we see we see all sorts of weird things happen, where we can see law being instrumentalized and this old Habsburg state and its assiduous adherence to law breaking apart. And some of these things happen in the Slovenian-speaking parts of southern Styria and in Carinthia, where numerous Slovenian priests and national politicians are arrested on the basis of military provisions of speaking against the dynasty or speaking against the state, but they're arrested under emergency law for things that happened in 1910 or 1912. Or, for instance, much of the population in the village called Maria Rasta Ruja in southern Styria many people were arrested on the basis of them celebrating a so-called festival on St. Vitus Day, June 28th, 1914. This was a sort of a nationalist type of festival. But the Habsburg gendarmes in August received reports that the Slovenes were celebrating the death of Franz Ferdinand. And they went in and arrested many of the people who participated in the celebration, often on the basis of denunciations by local German speakers. The bureaucracy finds out and starts to intervene through back channels. So the governor of Styria represses all reports of these arrests in the press and tries to find out the source of these things. And there was an order from a local colonel that ordered that all of these Slovenian national activists just be arrested on the basis of being unpatriotic or treasonous. By the time a lot of these prosecutions reached a Habsburg judge, priests and various just regular Slovenian village residents came before a judge, and the judge often would dismiss the case based on a lack of evidence or based on the fact that this was a complete misunderstanding. And the military increasingly thought that this was bad, that they couldn't count on Habsburg officials to actually implement the justice that they sought. So they increasingly wanted to do things on their own. We see other problems in the administration of justice, increasingly as the military tries to take over justice and prosecute crimes against the war-making capabilities of the Habsburg state under martial law with a jury of 5 officers who are also prosecuting the case. We see that the civilian authorities don't know how to react to this. They're astonished. In one case I read about, that's a completely fascinating case, is Johann Eichhoff, who is a very conservative civil servant in the Interior Ministry, who gets appointed as a liaison to the Army High Command. And in his memoirs, he writes about a case of a jurist coming into contact with a local military commander. The military commander says to the jurist at first, "I know this is a legally trained official, right? I know people like you lawyers. I have no intention of causing you any difficulty. You have your orders, we have ours. You have nothing to fear from me." So they think they have an understanding. A few days later, the officer summons the jurist and says, "I want you to take a look at a list of 10 persons guilty of high treason. Tell me which ones you want to take over in order to convict them." The jurist looks over the 10 cases and determines that 2 of them are worth investigating. The corps commandant nods and says, "Okay." He calls for his aide-de-camp and says, "Here is a list of 10 persons guilty of treason. The jurist is going to take over the cases of X and Y. The others should be shot immediately without trial." He turns to the jurist and says, "As you see, I'm not going to make any problems for you lawyers. You handle the cases you want to handle." What I've also been looking at and investigating, and I don't know quite how to fit this into the story yet, is how the work of civilian officials who are engaging with the military as they're overstepping what they think are the constitutional lines of their authority. The bureaucracy increasingly is fighting from a difficult position. In Galicia, of course, the province is completely overrun by the Russians. Many members of the civil service escape to the interior of the monarchy. They end up trying to work in offices in Graz or somewhere in Moravia because they want to keep collecting their salary. And when Austria-Hungary reconquers Galicia in 1915, with German help, of course, the army wants to keep them out. not wanting them to return. What we see in places like Lower Austria, which is almost entirely German-speaking province, the bureaucracy is not really capable of being on the ground anymore. Many of them, of course, the younger university-trained officials are called into service by September, October 1914. I read one report of the district official in Weinhof on the Thaya, I think, who writes to Vienna saying, there are no more university-trained policy-making officials in my district. There were about 7. All of them have now been called up into the army. I am here by myself. So this bureaucracy is being thinned out right at the same time that these new wartime provisions are taking place. We see also increasingly the army enacting this erratic war on language in the Habsburg monarchy. Now, some of this can be quite entertaining when the army decides that it wants to ban the use of the Cyrillic alphabet in the Habsburg monarchy as a way of they think, exorcising the Serbian language from the earth. It's now just going to be called Croatian, and all signs in every railroad station in occupied Serbia, but also in southern Hungary, are going to be written only with Roman letters. And they make this proclamation over the monarchy and everywhere they control. And then the bureaucracy reminds them that, well, Ukrainian villages in Galicia use Cyrillic too, and mail is being misdelivered. That's comical. On the southwest front, Archduke Eugen, so a third cousin, I think, of Franz Joseph, who is the commanding general on the front between the Habsburg Empire and Italy, ordered customs officials, so civilian officials, who are now under military jurisdiction, to remove all Italian language signs from all roads, train stations, from all stamps, from all letterheads, and any government official notifications. Eugen informed the governor of Tyrol and expected him to do the same throughout the province. The governor refused, citing the constitutional laws of 1867, guaranteeing the right to speak, the right of citizens to speak the local language and to use it officially. So Eugen became impatient. He hired day laborers to go through all Italian and dual language areas of South Tyrol around Bozen and remove all the signs of railroad crossings, all warnings, signs from government buildings, and signs of private shops and taverns. Toggenburg complained to Vienna, the Ministry of the Interior, because he saw this as a violation of the December Constitution. The Minister of the Interior ducked and covered at this point. He passed it up the chain of command to the Prime Minister, Storch. Eugen tried to press his case. He wanted all the signage in the Trentino and the Austrian littoral, so around Trieste, to be changed to single German language signs. He even wanted the names of towns and geographic designations that were only known in Italian to be translated into German or given German names. Italian was to be officially erased. And Eugen grounded his actions to Toggenburg, this is 1916, with claims that it's not too much to demand from Italian speakers, if they're loyal, to know a few words of German. He claimed that there are also military reasons for having signs and geographic languages in German instead of Italian. The conditions in the South Tyrol, he wrote, were militarily unsustainable. It can no longer be tolerated that all troops who fight for the fatherland had to see the language of the enemy on our public buildings. He enlisted Field Marshal Konrad von Hötzendorf in this fight. So Konrad von Hötzendorf began applying pressure to the civilian government. Among other things, Storch wrote that the titles of government offices are laid down in imperial laws passed by Parliament and sanctioned by the Emperor. This is Storch talking to Konrad, I'm sorry. These things, these titles, were sanctioned by the emperor, and the army doesn't have the jurisdiction to change them. And Sturg writes to Conrad saying the observance of the existing structures of state would be in the interest of the military too, are they not? Sturg also then writes to the war minister, asking him to instruct his subordinate, Archduke Eugen, the grandson of Archduke Karl, the hero of Aspern, and third cousin of Franz Josef, that his authority is limited by the law, and that all directives concerning language signing cease. So we see this increasing battle between the civil service, the bureaucracy, and the military. And it also takes place in the field of appointments. And in the case of, this is a photo of the governor of Bohemia, the army launches basically a smear campaign against the governor of Bohemia, trying to get him thrown out of office because he's protecting disloyal Czechs. They also launch assaults against just local judges and what we'd say upper to mid-range officials. And one in Trieste, August Jakubik, who is a Slovene, comes into conflict. The army thinks he's too lenient on Italian separatists and Italian nationalists. They mined his past, looking for any reason to claim that he should be ejected from office. And they found one. He awarded a certain known Freemason, an irredentist, Hector Richetti, with the Order of the Iron Crown, 3rd class, in 1913. How does the civilian government try to protect itself against these assaults? Well, the Justice Ministry had their biggest weapon, correct procedure. And judges, they argued, could only be dismissed after convening a jury of their peers, i.e. other judges. And so his appointment as a judge, Jakubik's appointment, protected him from political interventions. So trying to close up, how does an infrastructurally strong state fall so quickly? If revisionism offers us something new, that we should see the Habsburg Empire with a new attitude, that we should think about it differently, that we should focus on its resilience or its integration, how should we talk about the First World War? I'm thinking that along these lines that 1914 was a break so fundamental with pre-19 forms of imperial politics that it required the creation of a new mode of politics beginning in the spring 1917 when Parliament was called back into action in Austria. And we can see in the parliamentary records in Austria from the reopening of Parliament that these parliamentarians who were elected in 1911 and voted on army bills in 1912 and passed them had completely turned against this state waging war, or at least the way it was waging war. But that's where I am so far. The larger picture, though, I think, is to start seeing the First World War as fundamentally important for the Habsburg Empire and for our histories of the Habsburg Empire. This was not a strong wind that blew a decrepit building down. It was something more fundamental taking place. So I think we need to re-examine our suppositions. We need to work with these new attitudes and also maybe revise them. And we need to try to integrate pre-war narratives with World War I narratives. My hope is that if we do this, we can understand not only the Habsburg Empire, but the First World War in new and important ways. And maybe, just maybe, not following Hegel, the Habsburg Empire will offer us a way of understanding European history. That it's a way of learning things about Europe that we haven't focused on before. I think the real tragedy of the First World War and the tragedy of the 20th century may actually be a Habsburg story. The Great War, for a long time at least, ended the possibilities and furthering of multinationalism in Europe. And instead of seeing the war as a moment which sealed the coffin of the Habsburg monarchy, which led these imprisoned nations out of their jail, it's important to understand what processes that were in play, what ideas, what imaginations the First World War interrupted and destroyed. What future multinational polity disappeared from view? I think these questions are once again, with the return to multinationalism and supranational state ideas in Europe, more fitting questions to ask of Europe's past. And I hope that we can put the Habsburg monarchy in the very center of that.